At first, Meghan hesitated. She knew that such a discovery could shatter the fragile balance they had fought so hard to create since leaving the UK. But in the end, she agreed. Deep down, she understood that Harry could never move forward without confronting the haunting questions of his past. And so the test was done. Weeks passed, but the envelope, the one they had both been dreading, finally arrived. The results were staggering, far beyond what they had prepared for. Harry's DNA didn't match the key genetic markers associated with the Windsor line, markers confirmed and passed down through generations. This wasn't just a mismatch. It was a rupture, a quiet confirmation of every whisper Harry had tried to ignore, every tabloid rumor, every hushed conversation. He sat alone for hours, staring at the document, completely stunned. He couldn't process it, couldn't even breathe. There were no cameras, no interviews, just silence, thick with the weight of the truth he'd just uncovered. The fallout was immediate. Harry's team canceled all upcoming public appearances. His phone was switched off. Meghan, who had been preparing for a private charity event, was pulled from her schedule. The entire estate fell into an eerie stillness. The truth they had uncovered wasn't just personal, it threatened the very fabric of the monarchy. It wasn't just about Harry's identity, but the future of their children and what it meant for the royal bloodline. While Harry grappled with the collapse of everything he thought he knew about himself, Meghan faced something far darker, the terrifying realization that everything they had fought for was crumbling. She had always endured scrutiny, racism, and vicious commentary, but now, a more profound fear gripped her heart. She had long sensed that their marriage might be built on a truth that no one dared speak. But now, that truth was coming to light in the most devastating way possible. As the DNA test shattered the myth of royal bloodlines, Meghan was forced to confront a deep, chilling prophecy she had once heard from the late Queen Elizabeth. Years ago, shortly after Meghan officially joined the royal family, they shared a rare, vulnerable moment over afternoon tea. The Queen, who had always been reserved and calculated in her words, leaned in and said something that Meghan would never forget. Legacy isn't just about blood, it's about protection, and not everyone receives both. At the time, Meghan didn't fully understand what the Queen meant, but in the aftermath of the DNA revelations, it became painfully clear. The memory haunted her as she sat in silence, her hands clutching a cooling cup of tea while Harry stared blankly at the test results. The truth was no longer just about Harry's identity. It was about the consequences of that identity and what it would mean for their children. If Harry wasn't of royal blood, what did that make their children in the eyes of the monarchy? What titles could be stripped away? What rights could be denied? What power did the palace now have to sever their branch from the royal family altogether? Meghan's once muted paranoia was now a full-fledged fear. She had always felt the subtle resistance from the institution, how staff hesitated when addressing Archie, the confusion and reluctance surrounding Lilibet's christening, the absence of formal portraits of their children. At first, Meghan chalked it up to resentment, racism, or political maneuvering. But now, it was undeniable. They were being slowly erased. The royal institution had long known the truth Meghan and Harry had just confirmed, and the machinery had been at work undermining, excluding, and preparing for a future where their family could be dismissed as a mistake. That realization shattered Meghan. She broke down in a way she never had before, behind the walls of the palace, unable to contain the weight of it all. The woman who had once stood defiant, staring down the full force of the press and public opinion, now felt small, powerless, and utterly exposed. But her grief quickly morphed into suspicion. How had this information surfaced now? Why had Harry decided to take the DNA test after all these years? Meghan began to wonder whether someone within the firm had deliberately pushed the test forward, not to reveal the truth, but to destroy them. Was this orchestrated? Was the test leaked? Was this their final move to sever Harry from the line of succession and discredit their children in one swift blow? She didn't need to voice it aloud. The fear in her eyes spoke volumes. As Meghan spiraled, the palace reacted, not with compassion but with cold calculation. The monarchy's greatest fear was not scandal, it was uncertainty. And when Harry's DNA test upended generational assumptions, the palace didn't comfort, it strategized. Rooms went dark, phones were confiscated, legal teams were called in, and behind closed doors, one name kept surfacing: Prince William. Within minutes of the DNA results becoming known, the palace went into silent lockdown. Communication staff were instructed to halt all outgoing messages. Public engagements were quietly canceled. Inside the palace walls, a chilling silence descended, not out of confusion, but from rapid, coordinated efforts to manage the fallout. The monarchy had weathered crises before, but this one was different. This wasn't about public perception. This was about blood and the royal bloodline. The first move came from the palace's private archives. Royal records, some centuries old, were immediately placed under review. Staff were prohibited from accessing genealogical documents without special clearance. Internal servers flagged all searches related to Harry, Diana, and key royal lineage terms. This wasn't about protecting Harry. It was about protecting the crown itself. If the line of succession could be questioned, then the very structure of the monarchy could unravel. Crown lawyers were called in without delay, known for their discretion and constitutional expertise. They were briefed in absolute secrecy. One document in particular was revisited, a sealed clause in the royal succession protocol, one that had never been invoked in modern times. Legal minds weren't asked for their sympathy. They were asked to prepare a contingency plan. Then came the unexpected twist. Prince William was informed of the crisis before his father. The move, allegedly made by royal advisors aiming to secure the future king's response, created immediate tension. Charles, blindsided by this, viewed it as a breach of protocol, a deliberate attempt to sideline him in his own reign. But William, ever the tactician, stayed quiet. He didn't react publicly. He listened. He gathered information, and he began to form his own internal circle. Meanwhile, rumors exploded among palace staff. The lockdown wasn't perfect. Whispers of illegitimacy, removal, and audits of the succession began circulating in hushed tones. The palace's greatest fear was coming true, not the scandal itself, but the loss of control over the narrative. Leak prevention became a full-time operation. Devices were checked. Staff were rotated. Even long-trusted aides were temporarily suspended. And then came the decision that sent chills through everyone inside the palace: isolate Meghan and Harry entirely. No calls, no messages, no olive branches, just silence. It was a calculated move. If the couple felt cornered, they would react emotionally, and emotion was easy to discredit. Meanwhile, royal advisors huddled to strategize. Some suggested a neutral statement about family unity. Others pushed for a high-profile appearance, a new royal project, or a conveniently timed announcement to divert public attention. The goal wasn't to confront the truth, it was to drown it in noise. But no matter how the palace maneuvered, the truth had already started to seep through the cracks. And what they didn't expect, what they never prepared for, was that someone outside the institution still held the power to bring everything crashing down. Long buried in the private archives of Althorp House, a handwritten letter from Princess Diana surfaced. It had been written during her final days and warned of a truth regarding her son that might one day be used against him. Diana's voice from the grave reignited the firestorm and reframed everything. The letter was discovered under unexpected circumstances. A longtime confidant of Diana's, someone who had remained out of public view for decades, came forward with a small, unassuming envelope. The envelope had been kept in a personal safe, untouched since 1997, in accordance with Diana's instructions. Its existence had been known only to a few, and its contents had remained a secret until now. Inside, the handwriting was unmistakable, looped, elegant, undeniably hers, but it was the words that sent shockwaves through the palace. Diana had written about her growing fears in the months leading up to her death, her sense that she was being followed and watched. She expressed concern not just for herself, but for Harry. She had sensed something dangerous hovering over her child. Diana didn't name names, but the meaning was clear. One line stood out above all. If anything happens to me, protect Harry from what they'll use against him. It's not about who he is, it's about who they need him not to be. The implication was chilling. Diana knew, or strongly suspected, the truth. She even referenced a secret attempt to confirm her fears in 1996, when she secretly contacted an independent physician to request genetic testing. But before she could proceed, she was warned by someone inside the institution to back off. The message was subtle but clear. She was treading on dangerous ground. Diana backed away from pursuing the truth, but she left the letter behind, hoping that someday someone would find it. That someone turned out to be Meghan. When the letter was read aloud to her in a secured location, away from cameras, Meghan broke down. The weight of Diana's words, the eerie accuracy of her fears, and the timing of the discovery were too much to bear. It was as though the past had reached through time, wrapping itself around the present and squeezing. How had this information come to light now? Why had Harry been compelled to take that test after so many years? Meghan began to wonder whether someone within the firm had deliberately pushed the test forward, not to enlighten, but to destroy. Was this orchestrated? Was the test leaked? Was this the final move to sever Harry from the line completely and discredit their children in one calculated stroke? She didn't need to say it aloud. The fear that clouded her eyes said everything. The walls were closing in, and Meghan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being targeted from within, not just by the media or the public, but by those they had once considered family. As the days passed, Meghan's paranoia only deepened. The silence that surrounded them was deafening. It wasn't the quiet of peace, but of careful, deliberate calculation. They were being cut off, isolated in a way that felt deliberate. Meghan couldn't escape the thought, what if they were being erased? What if everything they had fought for, everything they had built, was about to be torn down in a single, ruthless move? And while she wrestled with those thoughts, the palace behind the scenes was reacting with a cold precision that mirrored the growing tensions. The monarchy, ever accustomed to control, had switched into high gear, not to offer any solace or assistance to the couple, but to protect itself. There were no calls of reassurance from the palace, no offers of support, only a calculated effort to manage the damage. Phones were turned off. Communication lines were severed. Legal teams scrambled behind closed doors, and aides, as always, worked in the shadows, their loyalty tested as never before. It wasn't just about the scandal. It was about the very foundation of the monarchy itself. If Harry's bloodline could be questioned, if the very core of his identity as a royal was called into doubt, what did that mean for the monarchy's legacy, its future? Would the entire institution collapse under the weight of these truths? It was a matter of survival for the family. For Meghan and Harry, it was the cost of truth, too heavy to carry alone. Meanwhile, Meghan's mind raced with questions that had no easy answers. If Harry was not truly of royal blood, where did that leave them? What would their children be considered in the eyes of the monarchy? Would they be stripped of their titles, their rights, everything that was meant to secure their future in the royal fold? The fear settled heavily in Meghan's chest, a weight that pressed down on her, suffocating her every thought. How much of their lives, their marriage, had been built on a lie, and who was behind it? But the deepest cut came with the realization that the monarchy had long known what Harry and Meghan had only just confirmed. The whispers, the suspicions, the quiet resistance, they had all been part of a deliberate strategy to distance them from the royal family. It was no longer just a case of media harassment or public scrutiny. This was a concerted effort to erase them from history, to strip away their legitimacy before the world even had a chance to question it. And as the realization of this set in, Meghan felt a shift inside herself. The defiance she had once felt, the belief that she and Harry could overcome anything, no matter the pressure, began to fade. Now she was left with the uncomfortable truth that they had always been under surveillance, always watched, always controlled. The sense of betrayal of having fought for something that was never truly theirs began to feel like a heavy, irreparable wound. She broke down, not in front of the cameras or the public, but behind the walls of their private home. No one saw the woman who had once stood tall in the face of adversity, the woman who had challenged the palace and its deeply ingrained traditions. Now, she felt small, fragile, and utterly vulnerable. The world that had once seemed so full of possibilities now felt like a cage, one she could never escape. But it wasn't just grief that consumed her. It was suspicion, the creeping sense that they had been betrayed by forces far greater than the media or public opinion. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone had been behind the leak of that test, ensuring that it would surface at the most devastating moment. And as much as Meghan tried to find clarity, she couldn't shake the feeling that their world had been carefully constructed to fall apart from the inside out. The silence around them grew louder, the isolation more suffocating. Meghan's mind raced with unanswered questions. Had the test been deliberately leaked? Had someone inside the palace used the results to target them, knowing the devastation it would cause? It was. And just a test. It was the weapon that would shatter everything they had worked to build, and they had no choice but to face it. But as the days passed and the fallout continued, the palace, true to form, did not reach out with any gestures of support. There were no calls from the Queen or other royal family members offering solace or empathy. Instead, there was only silence, an eerie, calculated silence designed to protect the institution, not the individuals caught in its web. And as Meghan stared at the empty space where Harry once stood by her side, she felt the full weight of that silence. It wasn't just a lack of support. It was a deliberate act of abandonment, a sign that they had been left to face the storm on their own. Meghan's suspicions grew stronger by the day. She couldn't shake the feeling that the palace had engineered this crisis, perhaps not directly, but through a series of subtle, calculated moves that led to this very moment. Had someone within the royal establishment allowed the DNA results to leak, knowing the damage it would cause? Was this their way of forcing Meghan and Harry out, pushing them into the public's eye and watching them fall apart in real time? With every passing day, Meghan felt more exposed, more vulnerable, and more convinced that their fight wasn't just against the media. It was against an entire institution that had never truly accepted them. They had been used, manipulated, and now they were being discarded, all while the palace's reputation remained intact. The system that once promised protection had now turned its back on them. And the only thing Meghan could do now was face the fallout of her own suspicions and fears, knowing that no matter how hard they fought, they had been irrevocably changed by the truth they could no longer ignore. How had this information come to light now? Why had Harry been compelled to take that test after so many years? Meghan's mind raced with the possibilities, and a dark suspicion began to take root. Was this all orchestrated? Was the test deliberately leaked to expose them, to break them apart in the most definitive way possible? Had someone within the firm, those who had always maintained control, intentionally pushed this forward, not to enlighten, but to destroy? Was this the final, calculated move to sever Harry from the line of succession completely and discredit their children in one clean stroke? The questions gnawed at her, their implications far more dangerous than anything she had ever confronted. She didn't need to speak it aloud. Her eyes betrayed her deepest fear, and it was all too clear. As Meghan spirals into fear and confusion, the palace reacts, not with compassion but with ruthless calculation. The monarchy's greatest fear isn't scandal, it's uncertainty. When Harry's DNA test challenges long-held generational assumption, the palace doesn't comfort, it strategizes. Every move is meticulous. Every action is deliberate. Rooms go dark, phones are confiscated, and legal teams are summoned with urgency. Behind closed doors, one name keeps surfacing: Prince William. Within minutes of the DNA results becoming known, the palace shifts into silent lockdown. All communication staff are instructed to halt outgoing messages. Public engagements are abruptly canceled without explanation. Inside the palace walls, an eerie quiet falls, not from confusion, but from the rapid, coordinated efforts to control the fallout. The monarchy had weathered crises before, but this one was unlike any they had ever faced. This wasn't about the usual public relations battle. This was about blood, the very bloodline that had defined the institution for centuries. The first move came from the private archives. Royal records, some dating back hundreds of years, were placed under immediate review. Staff were barred from accessing genealogical documents without special clearance. Internal servers were set to flag any searches related to Harry, Diana, or key royal lineage terms. It wasn't about protecting Harry, it was about protecting the crown itself. If the line of succession could be questioned, then the very structure of the monarchy could unravel. Crown lawyers were called in without delay, their expertise in constitutional law a matter of urgent need. They were briefed behind closed doors, their instructions clear. Devise a contingency plan no matter the cost. One document in particular was re-examined, a sealed clause in the royal succession protocol, a clause that had never been invoked in modern times. The legal minds weren't asked for sympathy or support. They were asked for a way to contain the damage, to prevent any disruption to the royal family's public image. Their solution was a quiet one, a crisis management plan designed not just for the moment, but for the future. Then came the unexpected twist. Prince William, the heir to the throne, was informed of the crisis before his father, King Charles. This move, allegedly orchestrated by Roy advisors aiming to secure the future king's response, created immediate and palpable tension. Charles, blindsided by this, viewed it as a breach of protocol, an attempt to sideline him, even in his own reign. He felt betrayed, but William, ever the tactician, remained composed. He didn't react publicly. He listened. He gathered information. And in the shadows, he began forming his own internal circle, distancing himself from his father and positioning himself for what was to come. Meanwhile, rumors exploded among staff. The lockdown wasn't perfect. Whispers of illegitimacy, removal from the line of succession, and audits of royal lineage began circulating in hushed tones, growing louder with every passing hour. The palace's greatest fear wasn't the scandal itself. It was the loss of control over the narrative. It was the fear that the truth, once exposed, would spread beyond their reach, beyond their ability to control it. The palace had always been a fortress of secrecy, a place where every word, every action was calculated with precision. But now, that fortress was cracking under the weight of its own contradictions. The institution that had stood for centuries, shielded by its traditions and its bloodlines, was now faced with a truth it could neither ignore nor silence. The monarchy's very foundation, its sense of identity, its claim to power, was being threatened from within. And as the palace scrambled to regain control, one thing became increasingly clear: the game had changed. This was no longer a matter of protecting Harry or Meghan. This was about saving the monarchy itself.